Any tubehead worth their salt knows that there are two underground stations called Hammersmith. Same name, located practically next to each other, but entirely separate. Oh, but it doesn't end there, my friend. No. There have in fact been 5, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. You see, in the 1860s, Hammersmith was starting to expand from an agricultural village into a full-blown suburb of London, and the railways, naturally, wanted a piece of the action. Alright, let's start with the stations we know and debatably love. Hammersmith on the District and Piccadilly lines will be our first port of call. This was opened in 1874 by the District Railway. For a period of 3 years, it used to be their terminus before the line was extended in 1877 to meet the London and South Western Railway's line to Richmond. Yes, that's right, the Richmond branch of the District line wasn't even built as an underground railway, but more on that later. In December 1906, Hammersmith became a terminus again, this time for the Piccadilly line, or the Great Northern Piccadilly and Brompton Railway as it was known back then. Then, in 1932, the Piccadilly line was extended westwards. These days, the station entrance is pretty unimpressive, being inside a shopping mall, but it was not always thus. The station originally had one of those delightfully Art Nouveau buildings, not dissimilar to the one at Earl's Court, but sadly it was demolished in 1990 to make way for the shopping centre. One part of it does survive and is preserved inside the station. This tiling. The other Hammersmith station in use today is, of course, the Hammersmith and City Line station, which is actually one of my own personal favourites. It dates back to 1868, making it one of the older stations on the network, and much of the original architecture is preserved. Since 2009, it's also been served by the now inaccurately named Circle Line. The Hammersmith and City Line, originally the Hammersmith and City Railway, is the second oldest line on the Underground. It was built by the Great Western Railway, with the Metropolitan coming in on the action from 1867. Incidentally, the Great Western Railway's ownership is reflected in these benches. The Hammersmith and City Line became part of London Transport in 1933, and was part of the Metropolitan line until 1990. The line to Hammersmith was opened in 1864, and if you've been paying attention, you'll no doubt be wondering where exactly they ran, given that this station wouldn't open for another 4 years. Well, Hammersmith originally had another station just north of here. That's our third station. It's like the second, but a bit further north. And I couldn't find any images on it, or much information at all. Moving on. Now, the fourth is an interesting one. It's only slightly newer than the Hammersmith and City Line station, being opened in 1869. It wasn't an underground station per se, being opened by the London and South Western Railway. Mind you, some of the LSWR stations are now underground stations, as I said earlier, so you know whatever. The point of this service was that it ran from Waterloo to Clapham Junction, where it took the West London Railway, now part of the Overground, to a point north of Addison Road. Addison Road, of course, is now known as Kensington Olympia. This line would zoom down through Hammersmith, Ravenscourt Park, Turnham Green, Gunnersbury, Kew Gardens, and finally come to Richmond. And if that sounds a little familiar, it should do. Those stations would eventually be taken over by the District Line. The station in Hammersmith was officially known as Hammersmith Grove Road and was located very near to the Hammersmith and City Line station here. To make matters more confusing, the station name boards just said Hammersmith. So what happened? Well, put bluntly, this happened. The District Railway realised that if they just built a little extension to Ravenscourt Park, they could have their own Hammersmith station and give passengers a much more direct route from central London. As a result, poor Hammersmith Grove Road became rather pointless and closed in 1916. The Central London Railway, now the Central Line, expressed an interest in taking the line over, but this came to nothing. The station site has since been built over, but this demolished viaduct is a very visible ruin from the old line. On to station number 5, and this is the oldest station of all. This one was opened in 1858 and was not in fact in Hammersmith. It is in fact far nearer to Stamford Brook. It was opened by a company called the North and South Western Junction Railway. This was a railway that ran from Willesden to Brentford, which is now part of the North London line on the Overground. They also decided that they wanted a branch line to Hammersmith. This was generally considered a bad idea. The planned route wouldn't even have taken them to Hammersmith, but to a point west of the village. The so-called Hammersmith station was a converted house, perhaps a money-saving measure to mollify the shareholders. Trains consisted of one carriage hauled by a small steam locomotive, but the station was never particularly well used. In an effort to make it more attractive, it was renamed Hammersmith and Chiswick in 1880, even though it wasn't much closer to Chiswick either. But the arrival of the Hammersmith and City, the London and South Western Railway and the District Railway rendered the whole thing rather pointless. There wasn't even a direct train. Passengers had to change at Southampton. Before that, the system was even more convoluted, but that's a story for another video. The only real advantage you might get from taking this route is if you just happened to need to get to slightly west of Hammersmith. That small advantage disappeared in 1912 when Stamford Brook Station was opened and poached those passengers. In 1917 the branch line closed for good. Now the site of this station too has been built over. So that means that for a period from 1874 to 1916 there were 4 different trains you could take to get to Hammersmith. And do you think it's a pain in the backside changing trains there now? Hi all, thanks for watching this convoluted episode of Tales from the Tube. If you enjoyed it, a like would not go unappreciated, nor would a share. And if you're not already subscribed, consider doing so for more underground fun. For instance, there was a lot of crazy stuff about the North and South Western Junction Railway that would have weighed this video down, but might make a good video in its own right. And I must admit that I'm a little curious about the Central London Railway's plans for Hammersmith. Did you know about all these different stations in Hammersmith? Were the closed ones entirely without merit? After all, London's changed a lot over the past century. Could Hammersmith use an overground station, for instance? Let me know in the comments section. And I'll see you very soon for another tale from the tube.